Now we come to the most important work of Horace's life. If someone asks, which single book made Horace one of the greatest literary critics in history? The answer is Ars Poetica. Everything we study about Horace's literary criticism mainly comes from this one remarkable work. So, this slide is one of the most important slides in our entire presentation. Let us understand it carefully. What does Ars Poetica mean? First, let us understand the title. The title is Ars Poetica. This is a Latin phrase. The word ars means art. The word poetica means poetry. So, Ars Poetica simply means the art of poetry. Notice something interesting. Horace does not call it the rules of poetry. He calls it the art of poetry. Why? Because writing poetry is not like following a machine's instruction manual. It is an art. It requires talent, practice, judgment, imagination, patience, and skill. Horace wanted to teach poets how to develop that artistic skill. Why did Horace write Ars Poetica? Now, let us ask another important question. Why did Horace write this work? Remember the previous slide. During the Augustan age, many people began writing poetry. Some were excellent poets, but many were inexperienced writers. Their poems lacked unity, their language was confusing, their characters were unrealistic, their stories became disorganized. Horace wanted to solve this problem. He wanted to guide young poets. Instead of criticizing them harshly, he decided to teach them. Think of a cricket coach. When a beginner holds the bat incorrectly, the coach does not simply say, "You are a bad player." Instead, he explains the correct technique. Horace became that kind of teacher for poets. Ars Poetica is therefore a guidebook for becoming a better writer. The format of the work. Now look at the right side of the slide. It says, format. An informal letter offering advice to the wealthy Piso families would-be poets. This is a very important examination point. Ars Poetica is not a textbook. It is not a philosophical essay. It is actually written as a letter. The letter is addressed to the Piso family, an educated Roman family. It is generally believed that Horace wrote this letter to Lucius Calpurnius Piso and his sons, who were interested in writing poetry. Imagine an experienced professor writing a long personal letter to 3 students who want to become authors. Instead of giving classroom lectures, the professor shares advice based on years of experience. That is exactly how Ars Poetica is written. This conversational style makes the work enjoyable to read. Horace does not sound like a strict examiner. He sounds like an experienced mentor guiding young writers. The structure of the work. Now let us look at the left side of the slide. It tells us that the work contains 476 lines of hexameter verse. Let us understand these two terms. First, 476 lines. This simply tells us the length of the work. It is not a huge book. It is a relatively short poem. Yet these 476 lines influenced literary criticism for nearly 2,000 years. This teaches us an important lesson. A book does not need to be long to become great. Sometimes a small book changes the history of ideas. Now let us understand hexameter verse. Hexameter was one of the most important poetic meters in ancient Greek and Roman literature. The word hexa means 6. So, a line of hexameter generally contains 6 metrical feet. Many famous epic poems, including Virgil's Aeneid, were written in this meter. Horace chose this respected poetic form because he wanted his work to possess both beauty and authority. For examination purposes, simply remember, Ars Poetica consists of 476 lines written in dactylic hexameter. A beautiful paradox. Now let us examine the bottom left box. It contains one of the most fascinating ideas about this work. It says, a work of literary theory, but written as a poem itself. This is called a paradox. What is a paradox? A paradox is something that appears unusual or contradictory but is actually true. Let me explain with a simple example. Imagine a cooking teacher teaching cooking by actually preparing food in front of the students. The lesson itself becomes the demonstration. Similarly, Horace teaches poetry by writing poetry. Instead of explaining poetic beauty in plain prose, He demonstrates poetic beauty through his own writing. His literary criticism becomes an example of good literature. That is why scholars admire Ars Poetica not only for its ideas but also for its artistic quality. The theory and the practice become one. This is one of the reasons why the work has remained famous for centuries. What does Horace teach in Ars Poetica? Although this slide introduces the work, let us briefly understand what kinds of advice Horace gives. Throughout Ars Poetica, Horace explains many practical principles. He teaches writers to choose subjects suitable to their abilities. He advises them to maintain unity. He tells them that characters should behave consistently. He encourages careful revision instead of hurried publication. He reminds poets to read the great masters. He insists that talent alone is not enough. Hard work and continuous practice are equally important. Notice something remarkable. Most of his advice is still useful today. Whether someone writes poetry, novels, films, speeches, or even YouTube scripts, these principles continue to apply. That is why Ars Poetica remains relevant even in the 21st century. The legacy of Ars Poetica. Now let us move to the final box on the slide. It discusses the work's legacy. The slide mentions that Ars Poetica was first translated into English in 1556 by Thomas Drant. Later, in 1640, another important English translation was produced by Ben Jonson, one of England's greatest Renaissance dramatists and critics. Why are these translations important? Because they introduced Horace's ideas to English writers. From that point onward, Horace began influencing English literature. Many famous writers, including Ben Jonson, John Dryden, Alexander Pope, Samuel Johnson, and numerous later critics, admired Horace's principles. His influence spread across Europe. Eventually, his ideas became part of literary education throughout the world. Even today, when students study literary criticism in universities, Horace continues to occupy a central place. This is the lasting power of Ars Poetica. Why is Ars Poetica called Horace's masterpiece? Before we conclude, let us answer one final question. Why is Ars Poetica considered Horace's masterpiece? Because it is much more than a poem. It is a practical handbook for writers. It combines literature, philosophy, artistic experience, and common sense. It teaches not only how to write beautifully but also how to think carefully about literature. Unlike many theoretical books that discuss abstract ideas, Horace gives practical advice that writers can immediately apply. That is why generations of poets, critics, teachers, and students have continued to read this work for nearly 2,000 years. Let us quickly revise this slide. Ars Poetica means the art of poetry. It is Horace's greatest work of literary criticism. It is written as an informal poetic letter addressed to the Piso family. It contains 476 lines written in dactylic hexameter. It is a unique work because it teaches poetry through poetry itself. It provides practical guidance for poets on writing, style, unity, characterization, revision, and artistic excellence. Its English translations by Thomas Drant and Ben Jonson helped spread Horace's ideas throughout Europe, making Ars Poetica one of the most influential works in the history of literary criticism. In the next slide, we will begin studying the actual principles that Horace teaches in Ars Poetica, starting with his famous ideas about the purpose and nature of poetry. Now that we have understood Horace's masterpiece, Ars Poetica, we are ready to study the ideas inside it. This slide introduces one of the most helpful ways to understand Horace's theory. Imagine you are looking at a beautiful temple. A temple cannot stand without strong pillars. If one pillar breaks, the entire structure becomes weak. Horace believed that poetry is very similar. A great poem is supported by three essential pillars. If any one of these pillars is weak, the poem itself becomes weak. Look carefully at the picture. At the top is the art of poetry. This represents the perfect poem. But this beautiful structure is supported by three pillars. The first pillar is poesis. The second pillar is poema. The third pillar is poeta. Together, these three pillars explain everything that Horace expected from good poetry. Let us understand each one in detail. First pillar, poiesis. Let us begin with the first pillar. It is called poiesis. The word comes from Greek and Latin traditions and simply refers to the subject matter of poetry. In simple words, poiesis answers the question, what is the poem about? Before a poet writes even the first line, the poet must first decide the subject. Is the poem about love, war, friendship, nature, death, heroism, justice, family? The subject is the foundation of the poem. Now Horace gives an important piece of advice. He says a poet should choose a subject that matches his ability. This may sound simple, but it is one of the wisest lessons in literature. Let me explain. Imagine a beginner in cricket deciding to face the world's fastest bowler without any practice. Will that be wise? Probably not. The player should first master the basics. Similarly, Horace advises poets not to choose subjects that are beyond their knowledge or skill. Suppose a young writer has deep knowledge about village life. It is better to write an excellent poem about village life than to write a poor poem about ancient mythology without understanding it. Horace believed that writers should know their strengths. When the subject matches the writer's ability, the poem becomes natural, convincing, and enjoyable. Another important point is that the subject should be meaningful. A poem should not exist merely because words rhyme. It should have something worth saying. Think of famous poems you know. Whether it is Shakespeare's sonnets, Wordsworth's nature poems, or Robert Frost's poems, each poem has a clear central idea. That is poiesis. Second pillar, poema. Now let us move to the second pillar. This pillar is called poema. Poema refers to the form or structure of the poem. In other words, poema answers the question, how is the poem constructed? Notice the difference. Poiesis asks, what should I write? Poema asks, how should I write it? These are two completely different questions. Let me give you a simple example. Suppose your teacher asks you to build a house using toy blocks. The idea of building a house is the subject, but arranging the blocks correctly is the structure. If the blocks are placed carelessly, the house falls down. Similarly, a poem must be carefully constructed. Horace believed that good poetry requires order. Everything should fit together. The beginning should naturally lead to the middle. The middle should naturally lead to the ending. Nothing should appear unnecessary. Nothing should feel out of place. This is what Horace later calls unity. Every part should contribute to the whole. Now think about a film. Imagine watching a movie where the hero suddenly becomes the villain without any explanation. Or imagine a comedy that suddenly changes into a horror film. Would the audience enjoy it? Probably not. Why? Because the structure lacks consistency. Horace wanted poets to avoid such confusion. He believed that every event, every character, every description, and every line should serve the overall purpose of the poem. The slide also mentions meter, plot, and rules. Meter refers to rhythm. Plot refers to the arrangement of events. Rules refer to the artistic principles that help maintain order and beauty. Horace believed that inspiration alone is not enough. A poem also requires craftsmanship. Just as an architect carefully designs a building, a poet carefully designs a poem. Third pillar, poeta. Now we come to the third pillar. This is poeta. Poeta simply means the poet himself. Notice something surprising. Horace does not discuss only the poem. He also discusses the person who writes it. Why? Because good poetry begins with a good poet. The quality of the artist influences the quality of the art. According to Horace, a poet must possess certain qualities. The poet should be disciplined. The poet should be educated. The poet should observe life carefully. The poet should read the great writers. The poet should accept criticism. Most importantly, the poet should never become lazy or overconfident. Horace believed that writing is hard work. Many people imagine that poets simply wait for inspiration. Horace disagreed. He believed that inspiration is valuable, but inspiration alone cannot create a masterpiece. A great poet studies continuously, practices continuously, revises continuously, learns continuously. Let me give you an example. Suppose someone wants to become a classical musician. Natural talent is certainly helpful, but without daily practice, that talent slowly disappears. The same is true for poetry. Talent is like a seed. Practice is the water. Without both, the plant cannot grow. This is why Horace places so much importance on the character of the poet. He believed that disciplined writers create disciplined literature. How the three pillars work together. Now let us see how these three pillars are connected. Imagine you are preparing a delicious meal. First, you decide what to cook. That is poesis. Next, you decide how to prepare it. That is poema. Finally, the quality of the meal depends on the cook. That is poeta. If the ingredients are poor, the meal suffers. If the recipe is poor, the meal suffers. If the cook lacks skill, the meal suffers. Only when all three work together does the meal become excellent. Poetry works in exactly the same way. A great subject alone cannot save a poorly written poem. A beautiful structure cannot save a meaningless subject. A talented poet cannot succeed without discipline. All three pillars are equally important. Why is this idea important? This simple model explains why Horace's criticism remained influential for centuries. Many critics focused only on the poem. Horace looked at the complete process. He asked three important questions. Is the subject appropriate? Is the poem well constructed? Is the poet worthy of the task? Even today, teachers unconsciously use Horace's method. When they evaluate a student's essay, they ask, is the topic clear? Is the writing well organized? Has the student prepared properly? Notice that these are the same three pillars Horace explained more than 2,000 years ago. His ideas remain practical because they are based on common sense. Let us quickly revise this slide. The art of poetry rests on three pillars. The first pillar is poesis, which refers to the subject matter, what the poem is about. The second pillar is poema, which refers to the form or structure, how the poem is organized through meter, plot, and artistic unity. The third pillar is poeta, which refers to the poet, the discipline, education, effort, and character of the writer. According to Horace, true poetic excellence is achieved only when these three pillars work together in perfect balance. In the next slide, we will begin studying Horace's famous principles for writing poetry, starting with one of his most fundamental ideas, the importance of unity and artistic consistency in every great literary work. Now we begin studying the first pillar of Horace's theory in detail. In the previous slide, we learned that Horace believed every great poem stands on three pillars. The first pillar is called poesis. Poesis simply means the subject of the poem. In other words, before a poet starts writing, he must first answer one important question: what am I going to write about? This may sound like a very simple question, but Horace believed it is the most important decision a poet makes. A strong subject leads to a strong poem. A weak or confusing subject leads to a weak poem. To explain this idea, the slide uses the picture of a tree. This tree is not just decoration. It is actually a symbol of Horace's theory. Think about a healthy tree. A tree has roots, a trunk, branches, leaves, flowers, and fruits. Although it has many parts, they all belong to the same tree. Everything grows naturally from one trunk. Horace says a poem should grow in exactly the same way. A poem may contain many ideas, many images, many characters, and many descriptions, but they should all grow from one central subject. Let us now understand the four ideas shown on this tree. Organic unity. Let us begin with the first idea. The slide says organic unity. This is one of Horace's greatest contributions to literary criticism. But what does organic unity mean? The word organic means something that grows naturally, like a living plant or tree. Nothing is forced. Nothing is artificial. Everything is connected. Imagine you are looking at a mango tree. The branches belong to the trunk. The leaves belong to the branches. The fruits belong to the tree. You never find a coconut growing on a mango tree. Everything fits naturally. Horace believed a poem should have the same natural unity. Every line should support the main idea. Every image should strengthen the central theme. Every event should help develop the poem. Nothing should feel unnecessary. Nothing should look as though it belongs somewhere else. Horace explains this idea using a famous example at the beginning of Ars Poetica. He asks us to imagine a painter creating a strange creature. The creature has the head of a beautiful woman, the neck of a horse, the wings of a bird, the body of a fish. Then Horace asks, if someone showed you such a picture, would you admire it? The answer is no. People would laugh. Why? Because the different parts do not belong together. Each part may be beautiful by itself, but together they become ridiculous. Horace says exactly the same mistake can happen in poetry. Suppose a poem begins as a serious love poem. Suddenly it becomes a horror story. Then it changes into a political speech. Finally it ends as a comedy. The reader becomes confused because the poem has lost its unity. That is why Horace tells poets to build every part around one central idea. A poem should feel like one living organism, not like many unrelated pieces joined together. Dead words. Now let us move to the second idea. The slide says, dead words. Old language naturally dies off. At first, this may sound surprising. Horace is telling us that language is alive. Just as people are born, grow old, and die, words also have a life. Some words become old. People stop using them. Eventually they disappear from everyday language. Think about English today. Hundreds of years ago, people commonly used words that are rarely spoken today. On the other hand, modern English contains words like internet, smartphone, email, and podcast, which did not exist in Horace's time or even a few centuries ago. Language changes naturally. Horace says we should not be afraid of this change. Just as old leaves fall from a tree to make room for new ones, old words disappear and new words take their place. This keeps language fresh and alive. New words. Now notice the next point. It says, new words. Poets can invent words, provided they are rooted in familiar usage. This shows us that Horace was not against creativity. He welcomed innovation. He believed poets could enrich a language by introducing new expressions. However, he also gives a warning. New words should not confuse readers. They should sound natural. Let us understand this with a simple example. Imagine someone invents a completely meaningless word and fills an entire poem with such words. Would readers understand anything? Probably not. Instead of appreciating the poem, they would become confused. Now imagine another poet who creates a new expression using familiar words in a beautiful way. Readers immediately understand the meaning and enjoy the freshness of the language. That is exactly what Horace encourages. Innovation should make language richer, not more difficult. Many great writers followed this principle. For example, Shakespeare introduced many new English words. Words such as lonely, fashionable, and majestic became part of everyday English because they were meaningful and easy to understand. Horace would certainly approve of this kind of creativity. Appropriateness. Now let us come to the final idea. The slide says, appropriateness. The poet must choose a subject within their power and limitations. This is one of Horace's most practical pieces of advice. He tells poets to be honest about their abilities. Every writer has strengths. Every writer also has limitations. A wise poet knows both. Imagine two students. One has carefully studied village life. The other has never visited a village but decides to write a detailed poem about it. Which poem is likely to be better? Obviously, the first one. Why? Because the writer understands the subject. Now imagine a beginner deciding to write a huge epic poem like the Iliad or the Mahabharata without enough knowledge or experience. The task may be too difficult. Horace advises poets to begin with subjects they truly understand. Once they gain experience, they can gradually attempt more complex works. Think of learning to ride a bicycle. No one begins by riding on a busy highway. First, we learn in a safe place. Then we improve step by step. Horace believes writing develops in the same way. Choosing a suitable subject increases the chances of writing an excellent poem. Choosing a subject beyond one's ability often leads to failure. The tree as a symbol. Before we finish, let us look at the tree one more time. The roots represent a carefully chosen subject. The strong trunk represents unity. The falling leaves remind us that old words naturally disappear. The new leaves remind us that fresh words continue to grow. The healthy branches remind us that every part of the poem should develop naturally from one central idea. This single picture beautifully summarizes Horace's teaching. A great poem is like a healthy tree. It grows naturally, it remains balanced, it keeps renewing itself, and every part belongs to one living whole. Let us quickly revise this slide. The first pillar is poiesis, which means the subject matter of the poem. Horace teaches 4 important principles. First, every poem must have organic unity, where all parts are connected to one central idea. Second, dead words naturally disappear because language is always changing. Third, poets may introduce new words, but these should sound natural and be easily understood. Finally, poets should choose a subject that matches their knowledge, ability, and experience, because appropriateness is the foundation of successful writing. In the next slide, we will study the second pillar, poema, where Horace explains how a poem should be structured and organized so that every part contributes to artistic perfection.